Space exploration has always demanded the ultimate price from those bold enough to leave Earth behind. But behind the triumphant launches and historic milestones lies a darker truth. The men and women who died not in the glory of space, but in the desperate, terrifying moments of mechanical failure, human error, and political recklessness. These are their stories, told in full detail, with the science, the politics, and the heartbreaking humanity that history books leave out. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, Apollo 1. 3 weeks before Vladimir Komarov's death on the other side of the world, America was already burning. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee climbed into the Apollo 1 command module perched atop a Saturn IB rocket on Launch Complex 34 at Cape Kennedy. They weren't launching that day. It was a routine, plugs-out ground test, the kind that NASA's engineers considered low risk enough not to require emergency crews on standby. Grissom was no stranger to controversy. He'd nearly drowned after his Mercury capsule sank in 1961, and he was famously critical of the Apollo spacecraft's design flaws. In the weeks before the test, he had hung a lemon on the command module's simulator, a blunt message to the engineers at North American Aviation, who had delivered what Grissom called a bucket of bolts. His frustrations were documented. His concerns were filed. They were largely ignored. The command module that January evening was pressurized with 100% pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure, a decision rooted in engineering tradition dating back to the Mercury program. Pure oxygen simplified life support systems, but it created an environment where nearly everything could burn. Velcro, foam padding, wiring insulation, nylon suits. NASA engineers had raised concerns about this configuration before, but the schedule pressure of beating the Soviets to the moon kept those concerns subordinate to momentum. At 6:31 p.m., one of the astronauts, most likely Grissom, reported fire, and within seconds a second voice said, "We've got a fire in the cockpit." The last transmission, garbled and brief, came just 17 seconds after the first report. The fire spread so rapidly, fed by the pure oxygen atmosphere, that the crew had no time to open the hatch, which required a complex sequence of 90 seconds to open under ideal conditions. The heat caused the pressure inside the cabin to spike catastrophically before rupturing the hull. Pad workers rushed toward the spacecraft, but were driven back by explosions and intense heat. It took 5 minutes to open the hatch. All 3 astronauts were found still in their seats, having died from asphyxiation caused by smoke inhalation within the first 30 seconds. The post-mortem investigation found their suits had fused to the interior of the spacecraft in places. The tragedy shut down the Apollo program for 20 months. The command module was entirely redesigned with a quick-opening hatch, fire-resistant materials, and a mixed oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere on the launch pad. It was a brutal, catastrophic lesson, but it may have saved the lives of the astronauts who followed. The moon landing could not have happened safely without the lessons written in the fire of Apollo 1. Valentin Bondarenko, the forgotten cosmonaut. Before Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, the Soviet Union buried a secret. Valentin Bondarenko was a 24-year-old cosmonaut, one of the original 20 selected for the Soviet space program. Bright, charming, and considered one of the most promising candidates in the group, he was weeks away from potentially flying in space. On March 23, 1961, he was completing a 15-day isolation endurance test inside a low-pressure altitude chamber filled with a high-oxygen atmosphere, the same deadly environment that would kill Grissom, White, and Chaffee 6 years later on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Near the end of his isolation period, Bondarenko removed medical monitoring sensors from his body, cleaned the attachment points with a cotton ball soaked in alcohol, and carelessly tossed the cotton ball aside. It landed on a hot electric cooktop inside the chamber. In the oxygen-rich environment, it ignited instantly. The fire spread to Bondarenko's wool training suit within seconds. He tried to smother the flames with his hands, but the effort was futile. The chamber's pressure door could not be opened immediately due to the pressure differential. By the time rescuers got to him, Bondarenko had suffered third-degree burns over most of his body. He died 8 hours later in the hospital. His last words, reportedly, were an apology. "It was my fault. No one else is to blame." The Soviet Union covered up Bondarenko's death entirely. His name was erased from official records. Photographs of cosmonaut training groups were retouched to remove him. NASA had no knowledge of his fate. Had American engineers known a cosmonaut had died in an oxygen fire accident in a pressurized chamber, it is plausible, perhaps likely, that the Apollo 1 fire might never have happened. Instead, Bondarenko's death remained classified for over 2 decades, finally acknowledged by Soviet officials in 1986. He was 24 years old, he had a wife and a young son. His story is a testament to how political secrecy compounds tragedy, how one nation's shame can become another nation's catastrophe. The Space Shuttle Challenger, STS-51L. By January 1986, the Space Shuttle program had flown 24 successful missions, and NASA had grown dangerously comfortable. The shuttle was being framed publicly as routine, almost like commercial air travel, reliable enough to carry a schoolteacher. Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, had been selected from over 11,000 applicants for the Teacher in Space program and was scheduled to broadcast science lessons to millions of American schoolchildren from orbit. Alongside her were Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, and payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. The night before launch, a teleconference took place that would later be described by one participant as the most morally distressing professional experience of his career. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company manufacturing the solid rocket boosters, had documented a well-known but poorly understood vulnerability in the O-ring seals that joined the booster segments. The seals were rubber. Rubber stiffens in cold temperatures. The overnight forecast for Kennedy Space Center called for temperatures as low as 18 degrees Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous shuttle launch. Senior engineers Roger Borjoli and Arnie Thompson presented data showing O-ring erosion correlated with cold temperatures and argued forcefully for a launch delay. NASA managers pushed back, demanding that Thiokol prove it is unsafe to fly rather than prove it was safe, an inversion of the standard engineering burden of proof. Under enormous pressure, Thiokol management took the extraordinary step of overruling their own engineers, asking them to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. The decision to launch was made. At 11:38 a.m. on January 28th, Challenger lifted off into a clear, cold sky. High-speed film later showed a puff of black smoke at the base of the right solid rocket booster at the moment of ignition. The O-ring had failed. For nearly a minute, a combination of combustion residue and aluminum oxide sealant plugged the leak. Then, at 58.788 seconds into flight, the plug gave way. A jet of superheated gas at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit began burning through the external tank strut like a blowtorch. At 73 seconds, the external tank failed catastrophically. The orbiter was not destroyed by an explosion in the conventional sense. It was torn apart by the sudden aerodynamic forces of Mach 1.92 flight when the vehicle's structural integrity failed. The crew compartment, built to withstand the stresses of launch and re-entry, broke free from the disintegrating orbiter essentially intact and continued upward to an altitude of nearly 65,000 feet. 4 of the personal egress air packs found in the wreckage had been manually activated, meaning at least some crew members survived the initial breakup and were alive during the 2 minutes and 45 seconds that the crew compartment fell toward the Atlantic Ocean. Pilot Michael Smith's voice recorder captured a brief, oh, just before breakup. The compartment struck the water at approximately 207 miles per hour, a force of around 200 times the force of gravity. No one could have survived it. Roger Boisjoli, who had fought hardest to stop the launch, was so traumatized by the outcome that he suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. He spent the rest of his career as a professional ethics speaker, warning engineers never to let organizational pressure override technical judgment. He died in 2012 and is remembered as one of the most morally courageous engineers in aerospace history. Soyuz 11. They were the first humans to successfully occupy a space station, spending a record-breaking 22 days aboard the Soviet Salyut 1. By every measure, the mission of Soyuz 11 was a triumph, until the moment it became the most quietly devastating tragedy in spaceflight history. Commander Georgy Dobrovolsky, flight engineer Vladislav Volkov, and research engineer Viktor Patsayev had exceeded every objective. They had conducted astronomical observations, biological experiments, and Earth photography. They had proven that human beings could live and work in space for extended periods. Their communications with ground control had been upbeat and professional. On June 29, 1971, they sealed the hatches between the station and their Soyuz spacecraft, undocked cleanly, and began the journey home. Everything appeared normal. The deorbit burn fired perfectly. The service and orbital modules separated cleanly. The heat shield performed flawlessly. The parachutes deployed correctly. The soft landing rockets fired on cue. Soyuz 11 settled gently onto the Kazakh steppe in the pre-dawn hours of June 30, 1971. Recovery helicopters were overhead before the spacecraft had even settled. When the recovery team opened the hatch, they found all 3 men motionless in their seats. Their faces turned blue. There was no sign of impact trauma, no fire, No obvious catastrophe. The capsule was intact. The landing had been perfect. The men were dead. The cause, pieced together afterward, was a small pressure equalization valve, a component measuring just a few centimeters that had opened prematurely when the orbital and service modules were explosively jettisoned. A fragment of debris or the shock wave from the pyrotechnic separation bolts had jarred the valve open. At an altitude of approximately 168 kilometers, with the capsule still above the Kármán line, the cabin atmosphere vented into the vacuum of space over the course of 112 seconds. The cosmonauts likely lost consciousness within 15 to 20 seconds. They died within a minute. They had no pressure suits. Soyuz 11 was designed without them because the cramped spacecraft couldn't accommodate 3 suited cosmonauts. There was one wrench on board. Post-flight analysis suggested the crew may have attempted to manually close the valve. The wrench was found near Patsayev's body. That detail, the wrench, is the most haunting aspect of the Soyuz 11 tragedy. 3 men, conscious and aware, fighting with a small tool against the vacuum of space in the 2 minutes they had left to live. It is an image of extraordinary human courage in the face of impossible odds. Their deaths mandated the use of pressure suits during all Soyuz launch and re-entry operations, a requirement that remains in effect to this day. Space Shuttle Columbia, STS-107. In the 17 years between Challenger and Columbia, NASA had rebuilt its safety culture, or so the agency believed. The Columbia accident would reveal that institutional blindness had returned, wearing the costume of experience. On January 16, 2003, Columbia lifted off on mission STS-107, carrying 7 astronauts. Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, mission specialists Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Michael Anderson, and Israeli payload specialist Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, a former fighter pilot who had participated in the 1981 raid on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. Their 16-day mission was dedicated entirely to scientific research, operating 80 experiments in the Spacehab module. During launch, a chunk of foam insulation broke free from the bipod ramp of the external tank and struck Columbia's left wing leading edge at approximately 530 miles per hour relative velocity. The foam weighed about 1.67 pounds. The impact took place at 81.7 seconds into flight and was captured by launch cameras. Over the following days, NASA engineers debated whether the strike had caused serious damage. A group called the Debris Assessment Team requested satellite or military telescope imagery of Columbia's wing to directly assess the damage. The request was denied. The rationale given by shuttle program management was essentially circular. Even if damage existed, nothing could be done about it. This reasoning was flawed at multiple levels. Options including a spacewalk inspection, an emergency resupply mission, or a rescue mission using Atlantis were theoretically available, but never seriously evaluated because management had already decided the foam strike was not a serious risk. That assumption was built on precedent, rather than analysis. Foam strikes had occurred on previous missions without catastrophic results. What management failed to account for was that they had been lucky, that surviving previous foam strikes did not mean foam strikes were safe, only that the damage had fallen below the threshold of failure. This cognitive error, mistaking absence of disaster for evidence of safety, is called normalization of deviance, and it is one of the most well-documented failure modes in complex organizations. The crew spent 16 days in orbit, completing their research completely unaware that their spacecraft had a breach approximately the diameter of a human fist in one of the reinforced carbon-carbon panels protecting the wing's leading edge. On February 1, 2003, Columbia entered the atmosphere at 17,500 miles per hour over the Pacific. For several minutes, re-entry proceeded normally. Then superheated plasma began flowing through the breach in the wing. Sensors in the left wing began registering thermal anomalies. Wire bundles melted. Hydraulic lines failed. The crew received fragmented data and was likely aware something was wrong in the final minutes, though the full picture was unclear. At 8:59:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Columbia broke apart over Texas and Louisiana at an altitude of 63 kilometers, scattering debris across 2 states. The Accident Investigation Board placed responsibility not only on the foam strike, but on NASA's organizational culture, specifically the failure to properly apply safety standards and the suppression of dissenting technical opinions. The board's report remains one of the most penetrating organizational autopsies ever written. Ilan Ramon had kept a diary during the mission. Fragments of it survived the breakup and re-entry, recovered from fields in Texas. His notes, partially legible through the heat damage, were later restored by Israeli conservators. They are now on display in a museum in Jerusalem, pages written in orbit by a man who had no idea they would become artifacts of tragedy. Every name in this video belongs to someone who understood the risks and chose to fly anyway, not because they were reckless, but because they believed the work was worth it. What separates their deaths from mere statistics is the human machinery surrounding each one. The engineers who were right and were overruled, the political pressures that turned spacecraft into propaganda tools, the institutional blindness that mistook survival for safety. The history of spaceflight is also the history of the catastrophic cost of ignoring the people who know most and speak loudest. If there's a lesson here, it's not that space is too dangerous to explore. It's that the danger is manageable, but only when institutions listen to the engineers, when safety is treated as an engineering standard and not a public relations position, and when the lives of astronauts are valued above schedules, budgets, and political optics. If you found this video compelling, consider subscribing for more deep-dive histories of the decisions, good and catastrophic, that shaped human exploration. Drop your suggestions for future episodes in the comments below.